December 22, 1944, the temperature had plummeted to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Bastogne, Belgium, a small town that had become the epicenter of one of World War II's most desperate sieges. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded by German forces, was fighting not just enemy soldiers but hunger, ammunition shortages, and the brutal cold that turned fingers numb and weapons unreliable. In a frozen foxhole on the southern perimeter, Corporal Daniel Reeves made final adjustments to what would become the most controversial and ultimately the most effective defensive position anyone in his division had ever witnessed. His hands, even through 2 pairs of gloves, could barely feel the wires he was positioning. But precision mattered, every angle calculated, every connection tested, every backup system verified. Because what Reeves had built over the past 3 days wasn't just a defensive position, it was a mathematical equation expressed in high explosives, a mechanical symphony waiting to conduct its only performance. 57 grenades, 23 trigger wires, 9 overlapping kill zones arranged in 3 concentric semicircles. An integrated cascade system that would either vindicate 3 days of exhausting work or confirm what everyone around him already believed, that he de-wasted precious resources on an elaborate fantasy. Reeves, that contraption of yours is the dumbest thing I've seen in 2 years of combat. Sergeant Harold Mackenzie hadn't been subtle in his assessment. He'd said it loud enough for the entire squad to hear, standing at the edge of what he called Reeves's ridiculous Rube Goldberg machine. His criticism carried the weight of combat experience. 23 months of fighting across Europe, from Normandy to the Netherlands to this frozen Belgian crossroads. You've wasted 3 days building a grenade trap that probably won't work and definitely won't matter, Mackenzie continued, arms crossed against the cold. 1 German patrol hits that mess and maybe you get lucky and kill 2 or 3 of them before the whole thing fails. Meanwhile, you could have been reinforcing actual defensive positions that might keep us alive when the Germans come in force. The other men in the squad had nodded agreement. Private James Morrison, never one to miss an opportunity for mockery, had christened it the stupid trap, and the name spread through the platoon like wildfire. Soldiers walking past Reeves's position would call out jokes. "Hey Reeves, when you finish playing with your Christmas decorations, maybe you could help dig some actual fighting positions." Laughter always followed. Even Lieutenant Peter Walsh, who generally encouraged creative thinking among his men, had expressed reservations more diplomatically but no less firmly. "Corporal, I appreciate initiative. God knows we need soldiers who can think independently. But we're surrounded by an entire German army. We have limited supplies, limited ammunition, and limited time before the next attack. Your trap uses 57 grenades that could be thrown by hand if we get overrun. The mathematical probability that all those trigger mechanisms will function correctly in these freezing conditions is essentially 0. The lieutenant had paused, studying the elaborate network of wires and carefully positioned explosives. "I've seen men waste time on complicated plans that collapse under combat stress. Simple usually works better than complex. And right now, we need simple solutions that we know will function when German infantry comes through that tree line." But Daniel Reeves had something his critics didn't: a lifetime of watching his father design systems that refused to fail. Growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Reeves had spent countless hours in his father's workshop. Robert Reeves worked as a mining engineer, designing safety systems for the coal mines that tunneled beneath Pennsylvania's mountains. Young Daniel would watch his father sketch elaborate mechanical diagrams, testing each component, questioning every assumption. "A safety system that works 99% of the time," his father would say, "is a death machine waiting for its 1% moment. You don't design for success, you design for failure. You assume every component will break, every wire will snap, every mechanism will freeze. Then you build backups for the backups. You create redundancy until failure becomes statistically impossible." Those lessons had shaped how Reeves thought about problems. While other soldiers saw grenades as individual weapons to throw at individual targets, Reeves saw components in a system. While others thought about killing enemies one at a time, Reeves thought about creating an integrated kill zone where overlapping blast effects would ensure no survival gaps. Before the war, he'd completed 2 years of mechanical engineering at Penn State. He understood tension calculations, blast radii, fragmentation patterns, and probability mathematics. He could calculate how far steel fragments would travel at what velocities, how blast waves would interact with terrain, how cold temperatures would affect metal brittleness and explosive reliability. What he'd built wasn't complicated for complexity's sake. It was sophisticated because sophistication was required. And now, as he made final adjustments in the pre-dawn darkness, he was betting his life and potentially the lives of everyone in his sector that his calculations were correct. The primary trigger wire ran 6 inches above ground level, positioned at precisely the height because his analysis of German infiltration tactics showed that soldiers moving through darkness focused visual attention at knee height and above. They watched for defenders, for obstacles at eye level, for threats they could see coming. A wire positioned below their focal point, invisible in darkness, camouflaged against frozen earth that would catch them. But Reeves knew that any single trigger could fail. Ice could form on the wire, changing its tension characteristics. A German soldier might step over it by chance. Artillery blast might sever it before the attack began. Relying on one trigger wire would be trusting luck, and luck was unreliable in combat. So he'd built 3 backup triggering systems, each operating on different mechanical principles. The first backup used pressure release mechanisms constructed from canteen cups filled with precisely measured gravel. When the blast wave from the primary grenades struck these cups, the gravel would be displaced, releasing tension wires connected to the second ring of grenades. This system would function even if every trigger wire was somehow detected and cut, because it relied on blast effects rather than direct contact. The second backup system employed heat-sensitive triggers salvaged from signal flare mechanisms. The thermal pulse from exploding grenades would heat wire loops to their release temperature, dropping additional grenades from elevated positions. This ensured that even if pressure systems failed, the heat generated by any detonation would propagate the cascade. The third backup was perhaps most elegant vibration-sensitive mechanisms built using firing pin springs and carefully balanced weights. These would activate from the ground shock of nearby explosions, ensuring that once any part of the system triggered, the vibration would ripple through the entire network. Every grenade served multiple purposes. Every wire connected to multiple triggers, every mechanism had alternatives. Reeves had calculated that even if 30% of his components failed a catastrophic failure rate, in any normal system the trap would still function effectively because of overlapping coverage and redundant triggering. The mathematical precision was extraordinary for a combat defensive position. Each fragmentation grenade had an effective casualty radius of 15 meters, though lethality varied with distance. At 5 meters, survival was unlikely. At 10 meters, serious wounds were probable. At 15 meters, fragments could still inflict casualties, but with decreasing probability. Reeves had positioned his 57 grenades so their 10-meter high lethality zones overlapped completely. This meant that anyone in his 900 square meter kill zone would be within the high lethality radius of at least 3 grenades, and most positions would be covered by 4 or 5 overlapping blast patterns. The geometry was beautiful in its deadly efficiency. 9 overlapping circles, each representing a cluster of grenades, created a field where there were no safe spaces, no gaps in coverage, no positions where someone might survive by chance. The math guaranteed saturation, but explaining these calculations to exhausted, hungry, surrounded soldiers proved impossible. They saw wires everywhere, grenades positioned at odd angles, mechanisms that looked fragile. They saw complexity where they wanted simplicity. They saw theory where they wanted proven tactics. The criticism had intensified on December 20th when German artillery began systematically pounding American positions. Every shell that landed near Reeves' sector sent his squadmates into nervous speculation that the elaborate trigger system had been destroyed. Private Morrison made theatrical inspections after each barrage, then reported back with exaggerated relief. Yep, Reeves's stupid trap is still there. Still stupid, still won't work when we actually need it. The laughter that followed felt like knives. Reeves kept working, kept testing, kept refining because he knew something they didn't. Intelligence reports he de-accessed through a friend in the Division S intelligence section indicated that German radio intercepts pointed to a major attack planned for December 22nd. The attack would concentrate on the southern perimeter, exactly where Reeves had positioned his trap. His critics thought he'd chosen his location randomly. They didn't know he'd spent hours analyzing terrain, studying German tactical doctrine, identifying which approach offered the best combination of cover and concealment for attacking forces. They didn't know he'd predicted not just that Germans would attack, but exactly where they would come from. On December 21st, Sergeant Mackenzie delivered what he clearly intended as a final ultimatum. Corporal General McAuliffe just told the Germans to go to hell. We're not surrendering, which means we're fighting to the last man if necessary. I need every soldier focused on defensive positions that will actually matter when the Germans come. I'm ordering you to dismantle that trap, recover those grenades, and prepare to use them the normal way. That's a direct order. Reeves had looked at his sergeant for a long moment. Mackenzie was a good soldier, a brave man who'd earned his rank through combat leadership. His skepticism came from experience, from seeing complicated plans collapse under enemy fire. He wasn't being unreasonable, he was being practical. Sergeant, with respect, I need 12 more hours, Reeves replied. If the trap doesn't work by 0400 tomorrow, I'll dismantle it myself and distribute the grenades to the squad. But if it does work, it could break a German attack before it reaches our main line. Mackenzie had studied him carefully. What makes you think that Germans will attack through your sector? Because this is the weakest point in our defensive perimeter. We have the fewest soldiers, the least cover, and the easiest approach terrain. Any competent German commander conducting reconnaissance will identify this as the optimal breakthrough point. They lines concentrate forces here because it offers their best chance to split our defense and roll up our flanks. The sergeant's expression had shifted slightly. You've thought about this. I've thought about nothing else for 3 days. Sergeant, a long pause, then 12 hours. Corporal. If nothing happens by 0400 December 22nd, you dismantle that contraption and we never speak of it again. Clear, Sergeant, but Reeves knew the Germans were coming. The intelligence intercepts had been specific. A major assault was planned for early morning December 22nd, targeting weak points in the American perimeter. German commanders believed they could achieve breakthrough and split the surrounded American forces, destroying them piecemeal. They had no idea one corporal had spent 3 days building a mathematical death machine positioned exactly where their attack would concentrate. During the night of December 21st to 22nd, Reeves made his final preparations. He tested each trigger wire's tension one last time, using a spring scale to verify that 4 pounds of pressure would activate release mechanisms. He checked every grenade's positioning, ensuring angles would direct fragmentation patterns for optimal overlapping coverage. He verified that heat-sensitive triggers were positioned to receive thermal radiation from primary blasts. He tested vibration-sensitive mechanisms by dropping rocks near them, confirming they would activate from ground shock. The temperature continued dropping. 14 degrees Fahrenheit made metal brittle and mechanisms unreliable. Explosive compounds could become unstable in extreme cold. Trigger mechanisms could freeze. But Reeves had designed for these conditions, using techniques his father had taught him for ensuring mechanical reliability in Pennsylvania winters that regularly reached below zero. At 3 in the morning, Reeves heard something that made his pulse quicken, the distinctive sound of tracked vehicles in the distance. Heavy engines, metal treads grinding against frozen ground. German armor moving into position for the attack. He alerted his squad, then settled into his foxhole to wait. The trap was ready, every calculation verified. Every backup system tested, either it would work or it wouldn't. Either he would be vindicated or he would become the fool who wasted 3 days on an elaborate fantasy that failed at the crucial moment. At precisely 4 o'clock, German artillery began its preparatory bombardment. The barrage was devastating. High explosive shells and airburst rounds systematically pulverized American positions, cratering the frozen earth, shredding trees, sending fragments screaming through the darkness. Reeves pressed himself flat in his foxhole, hands over his head, praying that none of the shells would land directly on his trap and detonate his carefully positioned grenades prematurely. 17 minutes of thunderous destruction, then, suddenly, silence. That terrible silence that meant infantry was coming. Reeves knew this rhythm. Artillery softens defenses, then infantry exploits the confusion before defenders can recover. Standard combined arms tactics, executed with professional competence. The Germans knew what they were doing. At 4:15, Reeves heard movement ahead. Multiple soldiers, attempting stealth but unable to completely silence the crunch of frozen ground beneath their boots. He estimated at least 20 men, possibly more. They were advancing directly toward his position, exactly as he'd predicted. German infiltration tactics emphasized using lead elements of experienced soldiers to probe defenses, identify weak points, mark safe paths for follow-on forces. These weren't inexperienced conscripts stumbling through darkness. These were veterans who understood combat movement, who knew how to advance under cover, who'd survived previous battles through skill and caution. Through the pre-dawn gloom, Reeves watched them enter his kill zone. They moved professionally, weapons ready, spacing themselves properly to minimize casualties from defensive fire. One soldier knelt to examine the ground, possibly checking for mines. Another signaled to soldiers behind him, indicating the approach appeared clear. 23 German soldiers were now inside Reeves's carefully calculated perimeter. They'd advanced past his outer trigger wires without detecting them. The darkness, the cold, the camouflage, everything had worked in his favor. The lead German soldier took another step forward. His boot caught on the primary trigger, wire positioned 6 inches above ground level, exactly at the height Reeves had calculated would catch soldiers focused on threats at eye level. The tension released. What happened next occurred in 19 seconds, though to anyone experiencing it, time probably seemed to fracture into incomprehensible fragments. The primary trigger wire released 3M to grenades positioned in the outer ring. These grenades had standard 4-second fuses. They detonated simultaneously at 4:17 and 11 seconds. The blast from these 3 grenades immediately triggered both backup wire systems. The pressure release mechanisms, those contained cups filled with precisely measured gravel, were displaced by the blast wave. The gravel fell, releasing tension wires connected to 6 more grenades in the middle ring. Simultaneously, the heat-sensitive triggers received thermal radiation from the initial explosions. Wire loops heated to their release temperature, dropping 6 additional grenades from elevated positions. 9 grenades had now detonated in rapid sequence, creating a wall of steel fragments sweeping through the German formation at velocities exceeding 1,500 feet per second. But the cascade was just beginning. The blast overpressure from 9 simultaneous explosions triggered pressure-sensitive mechanisms Reeves had constructed using salvaged artillery fuse components. These mechanisms released tension wires connected to 15 more grenades positioned throughout the middle and inner rings. The German soldiers, those still alive after the initial blasts, attempted to scatter. But Reeves had anticipated this exact response. His grenade placement was designed to channel survivors toward the center of the kill zone, where the highest concentration of explosives waited. Soldiers seeking cover from the outer explosions moved directly into the kill zones for the inner ring grenades. At 4:17 and 22 seconds, the inner ring detonated. 18 grenades triggered by both direct wire connections and by blast overpressure from the middle ring explosions created a concentrated killing field at the center of the German formation. The blast effects in this concentrated space were catastrophic, multiple overlapping fragmentation patterns with no gaps, no safe zones, no positions where survival was possible. The remaining 6 grenades, positioned at the far edges to catch soldiers attempting to flee, detonated at 4:17 and 28 seconds. These were triggered by vibration-sensitive mechanisms that activated from the ground shock of nearby explosions. Soldiers who'd managed to stay outside the primary kill zones, who thought they might escape, were caught by this final ring of death. 54 of the 57 grenades functioned exactly as designed. 3 grenades failed to detonate due to defective fuses, but their failure was irrelevant because the overlapping blast pattern meant their intended kill zones were covered by surrounding explosions. Reeves's redundancy principle had worked perfectly. The entire sequence from initial trigger to final detonation lasted 19 seconds. In those 19 seconds, approximately 427 pounds of high explosive and 17,000 steel fragments swept through a 900 square meter kill zone where 23 German soldiers had been advancing. When the smoke cleared and the echoes faded, nothing moved in the kill zone. Sergeant Mackenzie climbed out of his foxhole 50 yards away and stared at the devastation. The ground where the German patrol had been was torn apart as if some enormous predator had clawed at the earth. Equipment, weapons, and bodies were scattered across the entire approach route. Craters overlapped craters. Trees that had somehow survived the artillery barrage were shredded by fragments. Not a single German soldier had survived. Mackenzie walked slowly toward Reeves's position, his expression unreadable. Reeves climbed out of his own foxhole, expecting what? Criticism for using so many grenades on a single target? Questions about whether it had been worth the effort. Instead, Mackenzie stopped at the edge of the kill zone and just stared. The silence stretched. Then, how many grenades did you use? 57, Sergeant, and how many Germans? Reeves had been counting bodies while waiting for his sergeant to arrive. 23 confirmed, Sergeant. Possibly 1 or 2 more in the crater zones where I can't identify remains. Mackenzie continued staring at the destruction. In 19 seconds, yes, Sergeant. The sergeant turned to look at Reeves directly. I called your trap stupid. Yes, Sergeant. You did. I was wrong. Mackenzie's voice carried something Reeves had never heard from him before: genuine humility. That wasn't stupid. That was the most effective defensive system I've ever seen in 2 years of combat. I was an idiot for not understanding what you were building. Word of the trap's success spread through the American defensive perimeter within hours. Officers from other companies came to examine the kill zone, trying to understand how one corporal with 57 grenades had eliminated an entire German infiltration element without firing a single rifle shot, without exposing his position, without giving the enemy any opportunity to fight back. Lieutenant Walsh conducted a detailed inspection of the trigger mechanisms. He found remains of the primary wire, the backup systems, the cascade triggers, all exactly as Reeves had described. The lieutenant's after-action report, filed later that day, stated, Corporal Reeves has demonstrated advanced understanding of mechanical engineering principles applied to defensive tactics. His integrated grenade system achieved casualty-to-munition ratio exceeding conventional employment by factor of 4. Recommend immediate documentation and dissemination of design principles to all infantry units. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from the German forces themselves. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, which had launched the infiltration attempt, immediately halted further attacks through the southern perimeter. Their after-action reports, captured later, described the incident as Amerikanisches Minenfeld mit Verzigerter Zündung, American minefield with delayed triggers. German intelligence officers analyzed the attack and concluded that Americans had developed a new type of defensive weapon combining mines, artillery shells, and automated triggering systems. They had no idea it was one corporal with standard issue hand grenades and 3 days of creative engineering. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical result. German commanders, already frustrated by fierce American resistance at Bastogne despite overwhelming numerical superiority, now believed the defenders possessed advanced defensive technologies. This perception contributed to German hesitation and delayed subsequent attacks, buying crucial time for the surrounded American forces. When prisoners were later interrogated, they consistently mentioned fear of the explosive traps. One German squad leader stated, "We knew the Americans were brave. We knew they could fight. But when they began using weapons that killed entire patrols in seconds, without warning, without giving us chance to fight back or take cover, that created terror. We advanced knowing that any step might trigger destruction for our entire unit." It made men hesitant, made commanders cautious. How do you attack when you don't know if the next step kills everyone around you? This was psychological warfare at its most effective. By eliminating infiltration patrols so decisively, Reeves's trap created uncertainty that slowed German offensive operations throughout the Bastogne sector. On December 23rd, weather cleared enough for air supply drops to reach the surrounded American forces. Among the supplies were additional grenades, ammunition, and medical supplies that had been desperately needed. Colonel Steve Chapuis, commanding officer of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, personally delivered a case of grenades to Reeves's position. "Corporal Reeves, I understand you can make better use of these than most men. How many more of your traps can you build?" Reeves examined the grenades, calculating quickly. "With this many, I could build 3 more systems covering our most vulnerable approaches. Each system would require approximately 2 days to construct and test properly. You have 4 days until I expect the Germans to attack again in force. Build as many as you can, and Corporal I'm assigning you 3 assistants. Teach them how your system works. We need this capability distributed across our defensive perimeter." The 3 soldiers assigned to help Reeves were the same men who had mocked his first trap most severely. Private Morrison, who had named it the stupid trap, was the first to volunteer. "Lieutenant, I want to learn how to build what Corporal Reeves built. I was wrong about the trap. I was wrong about a lot of things. I want to make sure I'm not wrong about anything else that might save our lives." And there it was, the transformation that innovation creates when it proves itself undeniably. Mockery became respect. Skepticism became eagerness to learn. The same soldiers who questioned Reeves' sanity now listened with complete attention to every detail of his design philosophy. Over the next 4 days, Reeves constructed 2 additional trap systems and partially completed a 3rd. He taught his 3 assistants the principles that made the system effective: redundancy, overlapping coverage, sequential timing, failure compensation. These weren't just technical specifications, they were a different way of thinking about defensive problems. Private Morrison proved exceptionally quick to understand the underlying concepts. "It's not about making something complicated," he said while helping position grenades for the 2nd trap. "It's about making something that works even when parts fail. Every grenade serves multiple purposes. Every trigger has backups. The whole system is designed so that even if a 1/3 of it breaks, the rest still kills everyone in the zone." Exactly, Reeves confirmed. Most people think complexity means unreliability. But properly designed complexity creates reliability through redundancy. "My father taught me that in mining engineering, you don't design systems hoping everything works. You design them assuming things will break, and you build so much redundancy that breakage doesn't matter." The 2nd trap was positioned on the western perimeter, covering another approach route that intelligence identified as likely for German attack. This trap used 48 grenades arranged in a configuration adapted to different terrain, more open ground with less natural cover. Reeves taught Morrison how to calculate grenade placement based on ground slope, vegetation cover, and expected enemy approach patterns. Different terrain required different mathematics, but the underlying principles remained constant. The 3rd trap on the northern perimeter incorporated refinements learned from the first 2 systems. Reeves improved the trigger mechanisms, waterproofing, added additional backup systems, and refined the cascade timing for even more reliable sequential detonation. This trap used 62 grenades and covered an even larger kill zone. On December 26th, German forces launched a major assault on Bastogne's western perimeter. The attack concentrated forces exactly where intelligence had predicted and exactly where Reeves's second trap was positioned. 29 German soldiers advancing in pre-dawn darkness triggered the trap. The cascade sequence killed all 29 in 23 seconds. Not one reached the main American defensive line. The third trap was triggered on December 28th by a German patrol attempting night infiltration on the northern perimeter. 18 German soldiers died in 17 seconds. The survivors, those positioned far enough from the kill zone to escape the blasts, reported to their commanders that Americans had surrounded Bastogne with automated explosive fields that detonated in chain reactions impossible to predict or avoid. German tactical radio communications, intercepted by American intelligence, revealed growing reluctance among German soldiers to conduct infiltration operations against American positions. One captured communication stated, "The American defenses employ explosive traps of unknown design. Conventional mine-clearing procedures are ineffective. Infantry casualties from these traps exceed acceptable operational parameters. Recommend suspension of close infiltration tactics pending development of countermeasures." This was exactly the psychological impact Reeves had hoped to achieve. By eliminating German infiltration elements so decisively, he forced German commanders to question their tactical approaches. This hesitation, combined with improving weather that allowed American air support, contributed significantly to German failure to break through at Bastogne. The siege was lifted in late December when General Patton's Third Army broke through German encirclement from the south. But by that time, Reeves's traps had killed 70 German soldiers total, delayed multiple German attacks, and created psychological effects that exceeded their tactical results. After the siege ended, military intelligence officers conducted extensive interviews with Reeves about his trap design. They wanted to understand not just how he had built it, but why he had conceived it in the first place. What made him think differently than other soldiers? What principles had guided his design? The resulting report became required reading at infantry officer training schools. It identified several key principles that made Reeves's trap effective, principles that would influence defensive tactics for decades: redundancy in all critical functions, overlapping coverage eliminating gaps, sequential timing preventing target escape, and failure compensating design allowing system function even with significant component failure. But perhaps most importantly, the report emphasized Reeves's ability to think systematically rather than individually. Most soldiers thought of grenades as individual weapons to be thrown at individual targets. Reeves thought of them as components in an integrated system where the whole exceeded the sum of parts. This fundamental difference in thinking seeing systems rather than components was what separated innovation from convention. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne Division, awarded Reeves the Bronze Star for meritorious achievement in ground combat. The citation read, "Corporal Daniel Reeves, through exceptional ingenuity and technical skill, designed and implemented defensive systems that eliminated 70 enemy soldiers and prevented multiple infiltration attempts against critical defensive positions." His innovations contributed significantly to the successful defense of Bastogne and demonstrated extraordinary technical competence under combat conditions. But Reeves later said the recognition he valued most came from Sergeant Mackenzie, who after the battle simply said, "Reeves, I was wrong. Your trap wasn't stupid, it was brilliant, and I was an idiot for not seeing it. You taught me something important, that sometimes the craziest sounding idea is the one that works best, and the people who mock innovation are the ones who understand at least. The trap's success had implications reaching far beyond one siege. The Army Ordnance Department commissioned a comprehensive study on optimal defensive employment of hand grenades. The study concluded that coordinated simultaneous detonation of multiple grenades could achieve effectiveness ratios 3 to 4 times higher than sequential individual throws. This finding influenced development of the M18A1 Claymore mine in the 1950s. The Claymore's principle of directional fragmentation covering a wide area without requiring manual throwing, was a direct descendant of concepts Reeves had demonstrated at Bastogne. Engineers who developed the Claymore later acknowledged that reports from Bastogne had influenced their thinking about maximizing defensive lethality per unit of explosive. German military analysis of the Bastogne defense, conducted after the war, devoted significant attention to what they called the American defensive mine systems. German tactical manuals were updated to warn about complex triggered explosive traps that could cascade across large areas. The Germans never realized that what they feared was one Corporal's improvised system built with standard equipment and extraordinary thinking. Daniel Reeves continued serving through the end of the war, participating in Operation Market Garden and the final advance into Germany. He was promoted to sergeant and later to staff sergeant. His personnel file noted, exceptional technical aptitude, demonstrates ability to apply engineering principles to tactical problems with results significantly exceeding conventional approaches. Recommend retention and advancement to technical specialist positions. After the war, Reeves returned to Penn State and completed his mechanical engineering degree. He went to work for DuPont, where he spent 37 years designing safety systems for chemical plants. His career focus remained consistent with the philosophy that had guided his grenade trap designing systems that refused to fail even when components did. He held 43 patents, all related to fail-safe systems and redundant safety mechanisms. Industrial accidents that might have killed workers were prevented by backup systems Reeves designed. Chemical releases that could have devastated communities were contained by redundant safety valves Reeves engineered. His work saved lives not through dramatic battlefield innovation, but through quiet, systematic application of the same principles he learned from his father and proved in a frozen Belgian foxhole. In a 1986 interview, Reeves reflected on his Bastogne trap with characteristic modesty. People always want to know about the technical details. How did you position the grenades? How did you calculate the trigger points? How did you know it would work? But that's not really what made it effective. What made it work was understanding that you can't control everything in combat. Things fail, conditions change, people make mistakes. But if you design for failure, if you build in redundancy, if you think systematically about how components interact rather than hoping each piece works independently, then you can create something that succeeds even when individual parts don't. This philosophy of designing for failure influenced multiple fields beyond military tactics. Industrial safety systems, aircraft redundancy systems, computer network reliability all incorporate principles that Reeves applied to his grenade trap. The idea that systems should function effectively even when components fail has become fundamental to modern engineering across every discipline. The trap's legacy extends beyond its immediate tactical success or its influence on military doctrine. It demonstrated something crucial about innovation, that individuals given freedom to apply their unique skills can develop solutions that formal institutions might never imagine. Reeves wasn't following doctrine when he built his trap. He wasn't implementing standardized procedures. He was applying engineering principles he learned from his father to a tactical problem he encountered in combat. This bottom-up innovation proved more effective than top-down standardization could have achieved. Military organizations naturally favor standardized procedures that can be taught to large numbers of soldiers. Standardization enables mass training, ensures predictable performance, and simplifies command and control. But standardization can't anticipate every situation or leverage every individual's unique capabilities. Reeves's trap succeeded precisely because it wasn't standard. Because it applied specialized knowledge to a specific problem. Because one corporal refused to accept that conventional wisdom was the only wisdom worth considering. The mockery Reeves endured before his trap proved itself reveals how institutions resist innovation. His squad mates, his sergeant, his lieutenant all dismissed his work because it didn't conform to their expectations of how defensive positions should look. They valued simplicity and tradition over effectiveness and innovation. They trusted what they knew over what they didn't understand. Only when results became undeniable did attitudes change. 23 dead German soldiers in 19 seconds provided proof too dramatic to dismiss. But if the German patrol had taken a different route, if they'd avoided Reeves's kill zone, his trap might have been dismantled without ever being tested. Innovation often requires not just brilliant ideas, but also opportunity to prove them. And here is something worth considering. The German soldiers who died in Reeves's trap were professionals doing their jobs competently. They weren't incompetent or careless. They followed proper infiltration procedures, moved carefully, maintained tactical discipline. But they encountered a defensive system their training and experience hadn't prepared them for. They expected individual fighting positions with soldiers throwing grenades manually. They expected to identify defensive positions by muzzle flashes, to suppress defenders with return fire, to maneuver using standard small unit tactics. Instead, they triggered an integrated system that killed faster than human reaction time allowed. This is warfare's harsh reality. Technical superiority often matters more than individual bravery. The German soldiers who died were probably brave men, well-trained, experienced in combat. But bravery could protect them against a defensive system that killed in 19 seconds without giving them any chance to respond. They died not because they fought poorly, but because they faced innovation they couldn't counter. Modern military doctrine incorporates many principles Reeves demonstrated. Kill zones with overlapping coverage, redundant triggering systems for reliability, sequential timing to prevent target escape, and failure compensating design are all standard elements of contemporary defensive planning. Every military engineer who designs defensive positions today applies principles that one corporal figured out in a frozen foxhole in December 1944. But perhaps the most important lesson from Reeves's trap isn't technical, it's philosophical. It's about the courage required to build something unprecedented while everyone around you says you're wasting time. It's about trusting your own analysis when conventional wisdom says you're wrong. It's about understanding that innovation looks like madness until results prove it brilliant. They mocked his stupid grenade trap, called it Reeves's ridiculous Rube Goldberg, a waste of resources, a complicated fantasy that would never work. They said it wouldn't work, couldn't work, shouldn't be attempted. They ordered him to dismantle it and use the grenades properly, the conventional way, the way soldiers had always used grenades. Then it killed 23 German soldiers in 19 seconds, and the mockery stopped. Then it killed 70 Germans total across 3 deployments, delayed German attacks, created psychological impact exceeding tactical effects, and demonstrated principles that influenced military doctrine for decades. All because one corporal refused to accept that conventional wisdom was the only wisdom worth considering. Daniel Reeves proved that sometimes the stupid idea isn't stupid at all. Sometimes it's brilliant disguised as foolishness, waiting for circumstances to reveal its true nature. Sometimes innovation requires enduring mockery from people who lack vision to see what's possible. Sometimes one person with technical knowledge, tactical insight, and absolute conviction can achieve results that entire organizations never imagined. The Germans called it an automated minefield. The Americans called it the trap that saved Bastogne's southern perimeter. But really, it was proof that effectiveness matters more than convention, that results matter more than criticism, and that innovation requires courage to build what others can't imagine. The stupid trap wasn't stupid, it was brilliant. And in 19 seconds of cascading explosions on a frozen December morning, it proved that sometimes the greatest ideas are the ones that sound the craziest until they work perfectly. Sometimes innovation looks like madness until 19 seconds prove it genius.